two worlds collide in an unexpected way. One, a fierce self-made millionaire, the other a passionate non-profit idealist. They're forced to work together on a charity gala that could change lives. But the only problem is that they can't stand each other. Lines are crossed, secrets are revealed, and when love sparks, everything is on the line. Family legacies, reputations, and their future. Someone's walking away with it all, and someone could lose everything. Who risks it all for love? I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. If there was one place Lila Montgomery despised, it was her family's boardroom. The leather-bound chairs, the crystal chandeliers, and the tastefully modest display of the family name etched in gold on the wall. It all screamed wealth in that calculated, almost cold way her parents loved. But that afternoon, as she tapped her fingers impatiently against the mahogany table, she wasn't there for a business pitch. No, this was supposed to be family charity work, which really meant let's redeem our image and look philanthropic, as her sister Sarah would say. Lila's parents had insisted she oversee their family foundation's charity gala this year, a massive, ritzy event that was more about high society points than actual social good. She wasn't in a fantastic mood when the door opened, and in walked her soon-to-be co-chair for the event. Miles Turner, non-profit organizer extraordinaire, had a reputation for running his charity like a military mission. A lean man with a dark mop of hair, he was dressed in jeans and a plaid shirt, an outfit that looked wildly out of place next to her tailored suit. His eyes, though, were sharp and keen, observing the room like he was evaluating it for hidden traps. "Oh, great. You're early," he said, folding his arms and sizing her up with an expression that was neither a smile nor a frown, more like cautious disinterest. Lila raised an eyebrow, trying not to look taken aback by his complete lack of the usual formalities she was used to. "I'm always early. I like to know what I'm walking into." Miles looked around the room like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Good. Then maybe you can explain why exactly you're here." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Look, no offense," he continued, clearly unaware of or unfazed by her shock. "But I know your family likes to do this kind of thing every few years to boost their image. It's the charity equivalent of buying a designer handbag. Nice for show, but not really impactful." Ah, so that was it. The judgment. Lila could feel her spine straightening instinctively, her defensive shield snapping into place. "Believe it or not, I'm capable of running a charity event without breaking a sweat. I do this for a living, running projects, managing people, and getting results." He tilted his head, a faint smile twitching at the corner of his mouth. "Funny, I run charities for a living too, but I guess I do it for slightly different reasons." "Let me guess," Lila said, mirroring his stance. "You're here out of the pure goodness of your heart? Nothing to do with building your own connections or furthering your career?" Miles's brows lifted. "Oh, I see. You're one of those cynical types who thinks everyone has an angle." "No, I just happen to know people." He leaned in a little, studying her with a look she didn't entirely care for, like he was trying to dissect her. "All right, let's get one thing straight. I'm here because this gala will fundraise enough to build an entire community center. You're here because..." She wanted to say something quick and clever, something that would make him eat his words. But for once, she found herself searching for a response. Why was she here? Because her parents wanted her to? Because this was just another line in the family legacy she could pretend to care about? Or because maybe, just maybe, she wanted to prove she could actually make a difference? But she couldn't exactly say that, not to him. So instead, she lifted her chin and replied, "I'm here because I was asked to be, and I intend to make this event a success, no matter who I'm working with." For a beat, there was silence. And then, without warning, he grinned. "All right, Montgomery, let's see if you can keep up." Their first brainstorming session was painful. Every time she suggested a sleek, glamorous venue, he shot her down with something more community-friendly. Every idea she had for sponsorships, high-end designers, exclusive brands, was met with his deadpan, "Yeah, that's great if we're aiming for 2 weeks' worth of soup cans." By the end of the session, she was ready to tear her hair out. But worse than that, Miles actually had good points, and he wasn't afraid to shove them in her face. "Do you even understand the mission here?" he asked, leaning back in his chair with a maddeningly calm smile. "We're trying to raise money for people who need support, not for people to show off their latest Rolex." She clenched her jaw. "I'm well aware of the mission, thank you. Just because I wear designer doesn't mean I don't care. Really? Because I don't see how selling luxury cocktails helps underprivileged kids learn computer skills. Maybe because that's how we raise the kind of money that does help them learn, she shot back. He actually seemed to consider that for a moment, before sighing in a way that made her want to throw her clipboard at him. All right, we're not going to agree on everything. But if we're going to pull this off, we need to meet somewhere in the middle. I'll agree to one or two of your fancy touches if you agree to include some ideas that make a real difference. The worst part was, he was right. They did need each other, whether she liked it or not. She took a deep breath, then nodded. Fine, one or two. Excellent. He smiled. A real one this time. And for the first time, she thought maybe this wouldn't be so bad. But then he added, I'll handle the parts that matter, and you can make sure the rich people have pretty things to look at. Her nostrils flared. You know, for someone who claims to care so much about charity, you're remarkably condescending. For someone who claims to care about this event, you're remarkably disconnected from the people it's supposed to help. They locked eyes, both unwilling to back down. But then, to her surprise, he extended a hand. Truce? She stared at his hand for a moment, and though every fiber of her stubborn nature screamed at her to ignore it, she finally reached out and shook it. Truce. But only if you stop making assumptions about me. Fair enough, he replied, giving her hand a brief, firm squeeze. And for a moment, she could see past his rugged exterior, past the snarky comments. Maybe he wasn't just some self-righteous do-gooder. Maybe he was someone who, like her, cared deeply, just in a completely different way. As they let go, he shot her a small, knowing smile. See? We can actually agree on something. I wouldn't get used to it, she muttered, but she was already hiding a smile. As he walked out of the boardroom, she realized one thing. This was going to be far more challenging and far more interesting than she'd ever expected. The next morning, Lila found herself marching into the Foundation's office with her usual confidence, ready to tackle the gala plans head-on. But even as she walked down the hallway, she couldn't shake the frustrating image of Miles's smirk from yesterday. She'd stayed up half the night rethinking every conversation, trying to pinpoint exactly when he'd managed to get under her skin. At the office, she set her laptop on the conference table, determined to set the tone today. But just as she opened her email, in walked Miles, again in those ridiculously casual jeans, like he'd woken up 5 minutes ago and thrown on the first thing he'd found. He offered her a nod, as if they were old war buddies, and settled into a seat across from her, leaning back with his hands behind his head. You ready to start, Montgomery? Only if you can stop acting like you're in charge, she replied with a tight smile. Noted, he said, entirely unfazed, before clicking open his own laptop. So, I've been thinking, how about we do something different for the venue? Different? She raised an eyebrow. You mean, not glamorous? Exactly. We want people to understand the impact of this charity. So, instead of a swanky ballroom, what about hosting it in a reclaimed warehouse, with every dollar saved going directly to the community center? A warehouse? Lila echoed, trying not to let her horror show. That's ambitious. He grinned, and she was fairly certain it was because he knew she found the idea borderline absurd. Not ambitious. Effective. When people come to an event that looks serious, they take the cause seriously. She exhaled slowly, bracing herself. Okay, but hear me out. If we go with a rougher location, people might feel uncomfortable and less inclined to donate. They're here to give, yes, but they also want a memorable experience. A little elegance encourages generosity. Miles chuckled softly, rubbing his chin like he was entertained by her analysis. Let me get this straight. You're saying that if we add a little glam, they're more likely to open their wallets? Exactly. People pay for experiences, and if we want them to pay generously, we need to make them feel like they're getting something special. A night they'll talk about. Miles leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. All right, I can see some logic there, but I don't want to sacrifice the message. We're here to help people, not to entertain the 1%. She met his gaze, knowing she couldn't let him bulldoze her ideas. How about a compromise? We do a rustic chic theme. Reclaimed wood, eco-friendly decor, and touches of elegance that don't feel out of place. We'll blend our worlds together and show people they can have both impact and style. His smile shifted, almost thoughtful, as if he hadn't expected her to offer a solution that made sense. Rustic chic, huh? Sounds fancy. She bit back a grin. Only a little. And look, I'll even help coordinate. I have a list of vendors who could bring that vision to life without breaking the bank. He scratched the back of his head, seeming genuinely impressed despite himself. All right, let's try it your way, but only if we stay under budget. Done, she said, feeling an odd sense of satisfaction. They'd reached an agreement. They'd actually reached a compromise. Later that day, as they pored over details, Miles glanced at her over his laptop screen. So, Montgomery, what's your story? She blinked, surprised by the question. My story? Yeah, you've got this intense business-first vibe going on. I'm curious what makes someone choose spreadsheets over, I don't know, actually doing things that matter. Things that matter? She echoed, bristling a little. Look, it's just surprising to see someone like you here. Running a charity gala doesn't seem to be your usual speed. She stared at him, debating how much to reveal. My family has this legacy, you could say. It's expected. A sort of family duty. A duty you're not thrilled about? Let's just say I prefer success I've earned myself, she replied, keeping her tone measured. Running a business isn't exactly what my parents planned, but I made it work. So, here I am, checking off another family box. Miles nodded slowly, and for a moment, his gaze softened, a hint of understanding behind his eyes. So, you're here to prove something? To yourself? Or to them? Maybe both, she replied, avoiding his gaze. Anyway, enough about me. What's your story, Miles? You've got this whole savior of the people act going on. Where'd that come from? He laughed, clearly not taking offense. Let's just say I come from a different world than you. My family didn't have much, so I know what it's like to struggle. Working for a cause isn't a box to check for me. It's just what I care about. She thought she saw a flicker of pride in his eyes, a real, unpolished pride she wasn't used to seeing among the people in her world. And you're willing to clash with people like me to make it happen? More than willing, he replied with a grin. But maybe people like you aren't all bad. Oh? And what exactly do you mean by people like me? She challenged, half amused. People who walk around in suits and think money can solve everything, he replied. But this time, there was no malice in his tone, just a quiet honesty. Well, she replied with a shrug, sometimes money really does solve things. And if that's what it takes to make this gala a success, I'll use every tool at my disposal. He laughed again, and this time, the sound was warm, almost familiar. All right. I'll concede that point, but only if you let me throw in a few unpolished touches. Deal, she said, smiling despite herself. She almost didn't notice how close they were sitting until she looked up and found him watching her with a steady gaze. In that moment, she could feel a shift, a glimmer of something she wasn't sure how to handle. Was it respect? Curiosity? Whatever it was, she wasn't entirely opposed to it. As they wrapped up for the day, Lila found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was more to Miles than his blunt charm and scrappy determination. And by the way he held the door open for her, offering a quick grin as she walked through, she couldn't help but think he might be wondering the same thing about her. Lila didn't want to admit it, but her morning commute felt a little lighter than usual. She had spent more time than she'd care to admit thinking about yesterday's meeting with Miles. Despite his infuriatingly smug attitude, he wasn't exactly what she'd expected. She could still feel the memory of his grin as he'd held the door open for her, that hint of challenge in his eyes like he was daring her to question everything she thought she knew. But today, they had to get serious. The gala was only weeks away, and they had a mountain of planning to tackle. She arrived to find Miles already seated, flipping through a proposal with a distracted frown. "Montgomery," he greeted her, not looking up. "You're almost on time today." She rolled her eyes and took a seat across from him, setting down her folder of meticulously prepared ideas. "Good morning to you too, Mr. I Wear Plaid to Work." That actually made him glance up, and she thought she caught a hint of amusement in his expression before he flipped the page, acting like he hadn't even heard her. "All right," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Let's talk about the budget. I reviewed your list of potential sponsors, and I've got to be honest. Some of these aren't exactly our target audience." She arched a brow. "Target audience? I thought you wanted anyone willing to donate." "Not exactly." He put down the folder and gave her a steady look. "I want people who care about the cause, Not just about adding a charity tag to their list of tax deductions. Lila bristled. Those tax deductions, as you put it, are what get us the big donations we need. A few high-end sponsors could fund half the community center. Sure they could, he replied, folding his hands in front of him. But at what cost? If this becomes a night of overpriced caviar and diamond-studded appetizers, then we're doing exactly what your family's foundation has always done. Prioritizing luxury over impact. There it was. That familiar sense of judgment, creeping in as if he could see through every carefully constructed defense she'd spent years building. She could feel her temper rising, but she forced herself to keep calm. Maybe luxury and impact aren't mutually exclusive, she said, matching his gaze. If we bring in sponsors who can fund not just the center but educational programs, outreach initiatives, we could do more than you think. Miles held her gaze, unyielding. But what message does that send? That we have to wine and dine people into caring? Sometimes, yes, she replied, a little louder than she'd intended. Sometimes, that's what it takes to get people to pay attention, to realize this cause matters. Miles looked at her, and for the first time, she thought she saw more than just frustration in his eyes. There was something else, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even respect, but just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that maddeningly calm expression. Look, he said, his tone gentler but no less firm. I get it. We're from different worlds. But my priority is making sure that every dollar raised goes toward people who need it, not fancy napkins or a high-profile brand experience. Then maybe you're not seeing the big picture, she shot back. Yes, people come for the glamour, but that glamour is what makes them feel part of something. If they feel like they're making a difference while enjoying themselves, they'll keep supporting us in the long run. He leaned back, folding his arms, and studied her like he was reevaluating everything he thought he knew about her. You really believe that, don't you? That this wealth-driven machine can actually make a difference? Yes, she replied, surprising even herself with how certain she sounded. Yes, I do. People give what they can when they feel it matters, and sometimes what they can give is more than just a check. It's influence, partnerships, connections. That's worth a little compromise, don't you think? He looked down, tapping his pen against the table thoughtfully. Maybe, but I still think there's a line between compromise and selling out. Her patience was wearing thin, but something about the way he said it softened her response. Maybe for you there's a line, but some of us have spent our lives knowing that money is part of the equation, like it or not. You don't get where I am without learning to work with the resources you have. I'm just trying to make the best use of them. For a moment they sat in silence, the only sound in the room the hum of the air conditioning. And then, slowly, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. Let's try it your way. We'll keep some of the high-end sponsors, but only if we can balance it out with more direct donors. People who genuinely want to support the cause. A surge of relief washed over her, though she kept her expression cool. Deal. But even as she said it, she could feel the tension between them settling into something deeper. A respect that neither of them would admit, but both felt. This wasn't just about the gala anymore. It was about two people from opposing worlds trying to understand each other, to navigate the spaces where their values clashed and maybe, just maybe, overlapped. Great, she said, gathering her papers. Now that we're on the same page, let's talk venue decor. He laughed, the sound genuine and warm. Oh no, don't even think about bringing in those crystal chandeliers. She smirked. We'll see about that, Mr. Warehouse Chic. It was well past midnight, and the conference room lights were the only ones left on in the building. Lila sat slumped over her laptop, blinking tiredly at a spreadsheet of vendors and itemized lists. Somewhere in the evening, she'd kicked off her heels, discarded her blazer, and rolled up her sleeves, feeling less like a polished businesswoman and more like a college student cramming for finals. Across the table, Miles was hunched over a stack of papers, lips moving slightly as he double-checked their proposed budget. She'd never seen anyone so focused, and without a cup of coffee no less. Lila had already downed 3 and was seriously considering a 4th. All right, she said finally, breaking the silence. I think I've looked at this floral budget so long I'm actually forgetting what flowers look like. Miles glanced up, his face breaking into a tired grin. Imagine how I feel. I didn't even care about flowers to begin with. She rolled her eyes. You realize this whole no-nonsense image you have is basically a self-imposed obstacle, right? Oh, really? He raised an eyebrow. And what image would that be? Rugged idealist who doesn't believe in frills, she said, adopting a faux serious tone as she air quoted. But here you are, voluntarily staying late to figure out just how many centerpieces we can afford. He chuckled softly. You caught me, but in my defense, you're the one who convinced me these centerpieces might actually make a difference. Good, she replied, hiding a smile. It's called compromise, Turner. Look it up. They went back to their respective tasks, the silence between them feeling oddly comfortable now. Every so often, she'd catch him stealing a glance at her, and each time, he'd look away quickly, like he'd been caught doing something he hadn't planned on. After a while, she leaned back, stretching her arms and letting out a sigh. All right, you win. I need a break before my brain turns to mush. Without missing a beat, Miles closed his laptop. Come on, he said, nodding toward the door. There's a coffee shop down the street that's open all night. Trust me, you could use some real coffee. She raised an eyebrow. Real coffee? Are you implying my usual order isn't real? Montgomery, I'm saying if your coffee comes with whipped cream and sprinkles, you're missing out on what actual caffeine is supposed to do. She laughed, reluctantly following him out of the building and into the crisp night air. They walked side by side down the quiet street, the usual bustle of the city replaced by the hum of distant traffic and the soft glow of streetlights. It felt strange, out of place, almost magical. She was used to the polished world of cocktail parties and penthouse views, not midnight walks and corner coffee shops. The shop itself was small, tucked between two towering office buildings, with a neon sign buzzing faintly overhead. Inside, the decor was eclectic. Mismatched furniture, local artwork plastered on the walls, and shelves lined with old vinyl records. It was the kind of place she would never have sought out on her own. And yet, stepping inside, she felt oddly at ease. Miles ordered a plain black coffee, no frills, as if to prove his point. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to take his challenge and ordered the same. They took their cups to a table by the window, where she sipped cautiously, half expecting to wince at the bitterness. But to her surprise, it wasn't bad. Rich and bold, with a warmth that settled nicely in her chest. She glanced at Miles, who was watching her with a smirk, clearly anticipating her reaction. All right, she admitted. It's decent. He raised his cup in a mock toast. I'll take it. From you, that's high praise. They drank in silence for a moment, watching the empty street outside. And then, without thinking, she spoke up. Can I ask you something? Sure, he replied, a little too casually, as if he hadn't expected her to ask anything personal. Why this? She gestured vaguely, encompassing not just the gala, but everything about his chosen career. Why dedicate yourself to this work? To helping people, especially when it's not, well, profitable. Miles looked down at his coffee, turning the cup slowly between his hands. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he took a breath, his voice soft and thoughtful. I grew up in a place where no one thought I'd make it out. Poverty wasn't just part of my life. It was my whole world. I remember watching people struggle to make ends meet, to put food on the table, to survive. And I decided early on that if I ever had the chance to change things, I'd take it. There was a rawness in his words that took her off guard, a sincerity that felt out of place in her carefully curated world. She could almost picture him as a kid, determined and scrappy, fighting to make a difference even when the odds were stacked against him. She swallowed, feeling an unexpected pang of guilt. And, is that what you think of people like me? That we don't understand what it's like to struggle? He hesitated, then shook his head. No, but I do think that for a lot of people with wealth, it's easier to look away, to pretend those struggles don't exist. She wanted to protest, to tell him that she wasn't like that she cared, but she realized she didn't have the words. So instead, she said quietly, I think maybe I've been so focused on proving myself, on showing that I can succeed without my family's help, that I haven't stopped to think about what success really means. Miles looked at her, his gaze intense, and she felt a warmth rise in her cheeks. She hadn't meant to open up like that, but something about the quiet of the night, the worn-in feel of the coffee shop, made her feel real, in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. You know, he said, breaking the silence, you're not what I expected. She looked at him, surprised. Oh? And what exactly did you expect? He shrugged, smiling slightly. Someone who cared more about appearances than about people. But maybe there's more to you than I thought. She laughed softly, feeling the weight of their earlier tension ease, replaced by something warmer, something closer to understanding. Well, maybe there's more to you too. For the rest of the night, they talked. Not about the gala, not about the budget, but about everything else. Favorite books, childhood memories, silly dreams they'd never told anyone. And for the first time, Lila felt like she was getting to know Miles, not as an adversary, but as a person. By the time they returned to the office to gather their things, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. As they stood by the door, both of them hesitating to leave, he looked at her with a soft smile. "Good night, Montgomery," he said, his voice low and warm. "Good night, Turner," she replied. And for a moment, she thought he might lean in, might break the tension hovering between them. But he just smiled, gave her a small wave, and walked out into the night. As she watched him disappear down the street, she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been tightly wound for so long she'd almost forgotten it was there. And as she turned to leave, she couldn't help but smile, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The rooftop terrace sparkled with lights as Lila watched the city stretch out beneath her. The faint sounds of classical music floating from the gala pre-event they'd organized that evening. It wasn't the main event, but a small gathering for the core donors and supporters. Miles had argued for a simple dinner, but she'd convinced him a rooftop affair would help show their high-end sponsors just how impactful and memorable their event could be. He'd come reluctantly, in a dark jacket and, shockingly, an actual tie, though he'd tugged it loose the second he'd arrived. She'd teased him for looking like he was going to prom, and he'd retorted that it felt about as awkward as one. But now, as she caught sight of him across the crowd, she noticed he'd managed to relax. He was laughing, his entire face transformed as he spoke with one of the other organizers. She hadn't seen him like this, unguarded, without that hard edge of suspicion he usually wore around her. There was something startlingly captivating about it. She wasn't sure how long she'd been staring when he looked over, catching her gaze with a surprised smile that made her heart skip a beat. He started making his way over to her, and she quickly pretended to look interested in her drink. "Enjoying the view?" he asked when he reached her, glancing over the city lights. "Just making sure everything is perfect," she replied with a shrug. "We need these people to feel like their money's well invested." Miles raised an eyebrow. "So you actually care about what they think?" "Of course I do," she replied, though it came out softer than she'd intended. "I know we're different, but I want this to work just as much as you do." He studied her for a moment, and she could feel the weight of his gaze, intense and searching. "Lila, you don't have to prove anything to me." She looked up at him, caught off guard. For a long moment, they just stood there, the noise of the gala fading into the background. His hand was resting on the balcony railing, inches from hers, and without thinking, her fingers brushed against his. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, his voice low. "I have to admit, I didn't expect this partnership to go anywhere." "Neither did I," she murmured, her breath catching. She could feel the warmth of his presence, the scent of his cologne mixed with the cool night air. And for a second, the line between them felt thinner than ever. "Maybe," he said softly, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Maybe I misjudged you." She couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at her like that, with a mix of respect, curiosity, and something else, something that sent her pulse racing. He was close now, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him, and in that moment, she didn't care about the differences between them, or the doubts that had kept them apart. Before she could second-guess herself, she closed the gap, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, as if neither of them could believe it was actually happening. But then, his hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming something fierce and electric, like the unspoken tension between them had finally found release. It was over too soon, but when they pulled back, she was breathless, her heart pounding. Miles was watching her with that same intensity, as if he were memorizing every detail. "Lila," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But before he could say anything more, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and they broke apart just in time, as one of the event coordinators rounded the corner, clipboard in hand. "Oh, sorry to interrupt," the coordinator stammered, clearly oblivious to what she'd walked in on. But we're ready to start the presentations. Lila quickly straightened, smoothing her hair and forcing a composed smile. Of course, we'll be right there. The coordinator nodded and hurried off, leaving them alone again, the moment shattered. But, as they stood there in silence, Lila could still feel the lingering warmth of his touch, the way her heart was still racing. She glanced over at Miles, who looked as dazed as she felt. They exchanged a look that said everything their words couldn't, a silent acknowledgement of the line they'd just crossed. "Guess we should get back," he said, clearing his throat. "Yes, right," she replied, though her voice sounded a little unsteady. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, he reached out, his hand finding hers in a gentle, grounding touch. "Lila," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "We don't have to pretend that didn't just happen." She swallowed, feeling a mixture of exhilaration and fear. "No, we don't." He nodded, his thumb brushing over her hand briefly before letting go. "Good. Then let's see where this goes." She offered a small, tentative smile, her heart still pounding as they walked back to the gala together. And for the first time in a long time, Lila felt like she didn't have to prove anything, to herself, to her family, or to anyone. The morning after the rooftop kiss, Lila was still buzzing with a mix of excitement and nerves, reliving that moment every time she closed her eyes. But by the time she walked into the foundation office, reality had set in, and she was starting to feel the weight of that decision. Kissing Miles had crossed a line she wasn't sure how to handle, and it didn't take long for the complications to start. "Lila!" Her sister Sarah's voice broke through the morning calm as Lila stepped out of the elevator. Sarah was waiting in the lobby, one eyebrow arched, arms crossed, and a look on her face that immediately put Lila on edge. Sarah was rarely at the office. Her charity work was more for appearances than actual involvement. If she was here, it was because she had something to say. "What's wrong?" Lila asked, hoping to sound casual. Sarah gave her a once-over, clearly searching for something. "Wrong? Oh, nothing. Except I heard a little rumor about you and your new partner at the gala." Lila's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Rumor? Oh, come on, Lila." Sarah sighed, waving a hand dismissively. "I thought you were smarter than that. Miles Turner? He's practically a charity case himself. Do you really think he's going to understand our world?" Lila's cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "Sarah, it's not like that. Miles and I are working together. That's it." "Sure," Sarah said with a smirk, clearly not buying it. "But let me just remind you, Mom and Dad are trusting you to run this gala. And if they hear that you're getting involved with someone like him, it's not going to reflect well on you. Or on the family." Lila clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to snap back. She'd spent so much of her life working to prove she was more than just another Montgomery. She didn't need a lecture from Sarah, who was only here to uphold the family image. "Thanks for the reminder, Sarah," she said, her tone as calm as she could make it. "But I think I can handle this." Sarah gave her one last condescending smile before sweeping off, leaving Lila with a storm of emotions she wasn't quite sure how to process. The day wore on, and by the time she and Miles met up for their afternoon meeting, her mind was spinning with Sarah's words, casting doubt over the excitement she'd felt the night before. They sat across from each other, reviewing sponsorship details, but she could barely concentrate. Eventually, Miles looked up, sensing her distraction. "All right, Lila. What's going on? You've been quiet all afternoon." She hesitated, debating whether to say anything. But Miles wasn't exactly the type to let things go. "It's just my family," she said, forcing a laugh. They're not thrilled about us." Miles's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "Ah, they're worried I'm not their type." "It's not that," she said quickly, though part of her knew it was exactly that. They don't know you, and they're big on appearances." He nodded, and there was a flash of something almost guarded in his eyes. "I get it. Your family's worried that I'm a distraction." Lila winced, hating how bluntly he'd put it. "It's not like that, Miles. I don't care about their approval. It's just complicated." Miles studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Look, Lila, if this isn't what you want, if you think this is too complicated, just say so. I didn't come here to make your life harder. No, she said, a little too quickly. It's not that. I like this. I like us. She trailed off, feeling the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her. He watched her carefully, his gaze intense. Lila, I don't want to be your guilty pleasure or some hidden fling. If we're doing this, I want it to mean something. His words hit her like a punch to the chest, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. Miles was standing there, willing to risk everything, while she was terrified of the judgment that would come from her family, her social circle, her world. She looked down, feeling the familiar pull of doubt. Miles, I don't know if I can just turn my back on everything. This world, my family, they've shaped who I am, and they won't accept you. He took a deep breath, nodding slowly. I get it, but I can't change who I am either, Lila. I've worked hard to build my life around things that matter to me, things that go beyond wealth and status. She could feel a painful lump forming in her throat. She wanted to say she understood, that she could see the world through his eyes, but she wasn't sure she was ready to bridge that gap completely, to stand up to her family and take the leap he wanted. Miles let out a sigh, his voice softer. I'm not asking you to give up your world. I just want to know if I have a place in it. The question hung between them, a challenge and a plea. Lila felt her chest tighten, and she realized with a sinking feeling that she didn't have an answer. Not yet. Maybe I just need a little time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, a sadness flickering in his eyes. I understand, but just know, Lila, I won't wait forever. They sat in silence, the once light-hearted spark between them, now weighed down by the doubts and expectations pressing in on both sides. And as he left the office, she watched him go, feeling the sting of her own hesitation echoing in the hollow space he left behind. In that moment, Lila realized that her world was as much a cage as it was a source of comfort. And if she wanted to break free, if she truly wanted to be with Miles, she'd have to confront not only her family but also the walls she'd built around herself. The days leading up to the gala felt like a whirlwind. Lila barely had a moment to think about Miles, her family, or the silent weight of all the unspoken words between them. The final details had to be arranged, vendors confirmed, seating charts finalized. She threw herself into the work with a focus so intense it felt almost like escape, letting the constant demands drown out everything else. Miles was equally busy, coordinating the event's speakers and organizing the volunteers. Every time they crossed paths, they were either interrupted by a call or surrounded by people needing something, so their interactions had been brief, polite, and strangely distant. She could feel the unaddressed tension lingering between them, like the heavy air before a storm. Finally, the evening before the gala, Lila found herself alone in the event space, a grand ballroom transformed into a mix of industrial chic and subtle elegance, just as they'd envisioned. The reclaimed wood tables were set with centerpieces of wildflowers, rustic lanterns lined the walls, and the city lights spilled through the tall windows, adding a quiet beauty to the room. It was exactly what they'd planned together, a blend of his grounded vision and her taste for refinement. She was straightening a table card when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, heart skipping as she saw Miles standing there, hands in his pockets, watching her with a look that was somewhere between admiration and... was that sadness? It looks incredible, he said quietly, his voice warm but cautious. Thanks, she replied, her smile faltering. We did it. They stood there in silence, taking in the room, the months of work they'd poured into it, the memories of late nights, arguments, and a kiss that now seemed like a distant, fragile dream. So, he began, glancing away. Are you ready for tomorrow? She nodded, forcing herself to sound casual. Ready as I'll ever be. And you? Have all the volunteers lined up? Yeah, all set, he replied, his tone just as guarded. Another silence settled between them, heavy with everything they hadn't said. She could feel the question he wasn't asking hanging in the air, waiting for her to answer. Finally, she took a breath, deciding she couldn't avoid it any longer. Miles, I know things have been complicated between us, and I haven't exactly made it easy. He looked at her, his gaze steady but unreadable. You're right, you haven't. The honesty of his words stung, but she knew she deserved it. She took a step closer, feeling her defenses slip just a little. I'm trying, Miles. I want to make this work. I do. But it's hard. This world I come from, it has rules. And sometimes I wonder if I even belong in it. Maybe you don't have to, he said softly, his gaze unwavering. Maybe it's time to make your own rules. Lila felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly drowned by the familiar doubts. It's not that simple. My family has expectations. They've spent years building this legacy, and I thought I wanted to prove I could fit into it, that I could do things their way. But now, she trailed off, feeling the weight of her own words, the exhaustion of a lifetime spent trying to measure up. Miles took a step closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch her, but he hesitated, his fingers hovering inches from hers. Lila, I'm not asking you to give up everything, but I can't keep waiting in the shadows. I can't keep pretending this is just a work partnership. She looked up at him, heart pounding. She wanted to tell him she was ready, that she'd made her choice, but the words caught in her throat. The truth was, she was still terrified of letting down her family, of stepping into the unknown, of risking everything for a chance at something real. The silence stretched, and she could see the disappointment flicker across his face. He took a step back, letting his hand fall to his side. Lila, he said quietly, his voice filled with a sadness that cut deep. If you're not ready, maybe this isn't what you want. She shook her head, feeling the sting of tears. No, that's not true. I do want this. I want us. Then what's stopping you? He asked, his gaze searching hers, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she had. She opened her mouth, but no words came. All the fears and insecurities she'd tried to bury rose up, creating a wall between them, one she didn't know how to break through. She wanted to reach out, to pull him close and promise that they could make this work, but the doubts kept her frozen. Finally, he let out a sigh, his expression softening. Lila, maybe you need to figure out who you really are, and what you really want. I'll be here tomorrow for the gala, but after that, I don't know if I can keep waiting. Basi, the finality in his words broke something inside her, but she knew he was right. She needed to decide if she was ready to step out of the world she'd known and into one where she could truly be herself, where they could be together, without all the walls she'd built around herself. As he turned to leave, she felt a wave of panic, a desperate urge to call him back, to say something that would make him stay. But the words stayed lodged in her throat, and she could only watch as he walked away, disappearing into the dim light of the hallway. For a long time, she stood there alone in the quiet room, the lights of the city twinkling around her, feeling the weight of everything she'd spent her life building, and the sudden, painful realization that none of it would matter if she didn't have him by her side. And for the first time, she wondered if she was finally ready to let it all go. The night of the gala had finally arrived. The ballroom glittered with soft lighting, casting a warm glow over tables set with rustic centerpieces and elegant place settings. Guests mingled in designer dresses and tuxedos, admiring the view of the city from the grand windows, while servers glided through the crowd with trays of appetizers. Lila should have been proud of what she and Miles had accomplished. The evening looked seamless, every detail meticulously executed, a balance of elegance and simplicity. But as she moved through the crowd, thanking guests and smiling at familiar faces, her mind was somewhere else, on a conversation that still echoed painfully in her mind. Since their exchange last night, she hadn't seen Miles. He was here. She knew that much. She'd seen him talking with some of the event volunteers earlier, but he'd kept his distance, and she hadn't had the courage to approach him. Lila, dear. Her mother's voice snapped her back to the present, and Lila turned to find her parents approaching, her mother beaming as her father gave her an approving nod. This is incredible, sweetheart, her mother said, squeezing her arm. It's exactly the kind of image we hoped for. Lila forced a smile. Thanks, Mom. I'm glad you're pleased. Her father glanced around the room with a satisfied expression. This will do wonders for the foundation's reputation, and with the right connections, we might even land a few new partnerships. Of course, that was all they saw. Connections, reputation, image. She was barely listening as her parents continued to talk about potential donors and business deals, her gaze drifting across the room. She found herself searching for Miles, hoping he might look her way, give her some kind of sign that they still had a chance. Lila? Her father's voice broke into her thoughts, and she looked up to find him frowning slightly. Are you listening? Of course, she replied, masking her distraction with a quick smile. "I'm just making sure everything's running smoothly." "Well, you've done a fine job," he said, though his tone was more perfunctory than genuinely proud. "Just make sure you remember what tonight is really about. This isn't just an event. It's a statement about who we are." Lila swallowed, nodding automatically, but the words felt hollow. Who they were. Who was she, really? And was this who she wanted to be? As her parents moved on to greet other guests, Lila felt a surge of frustration, a realization that she'd spent so long trying to fit into this carefully curated world that she'd lost sight of what actually mattered. Just then, she spotted Miles across the room. He was standing by one of the tables, talking with one of the volunteers, his expression serious but calm. The sight of him sent a jolt through her, a reminder of what she was so close to losing. Before she could talk herself out of it, she took a deep breath and started toward him, weaving through the crowd until she reached his side. "Miles," she said, her voice coming out quieter than she'd planned. He looked up, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by that guarded look she'd seen the night before, as if he were bracing himself for disappointment. "Lila," he said, his tone polite but distant. "The gala's amazing. You did a great job." She nodded, suddenly feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to leap or turn back. "Thank you. But it wasn't just me. This wouldn't have been possible without you." He nodded, his gaze steady but unreadable. "I'm glad I could help. Really." They stood in silence for a moment, the buzz of the crowd fading as she struggled to find the right words. "Miles," she began, her voice wavering. "I know I haven't been fair to you. I've let my family's expectations, everything they stand for, get in the way of what I really want." He looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "And what is it that you really want, Lila?" Her heart pounded, the question feeling like a challenge and a lifeline all at once. She could feel the weight of every decision she'd ever made, every compromise and carefully crafted image she'd built to meet her family's standards. And standing here, with him, she realized that none of it mattered if she didn't have the courage to be honest, with him and with herself. "I want to be with you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I want to be with someone who makes me feel like I'm enough as I am. Someone who believes in what they're doing, who actually cares. I want this, us. And I don't care if my family doesn't approve." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like relief. For a moment, she thought he was going to reach for her, pull her close, and tell her it was going to be all right. But then, he glanced around the room, his gaze settling on her parents across the way. His face fell, and he shook his head slightly. "Lila, you don't know how many times I wanted to believe that. But you can't just say it. You have to be willing to stand up for it no matter who's watching." She felt a pang of hurt but forced herself to nod. He was right. Words were easy. She'd spent her life saying the right things, following the script that had been handed to her. But if she was going to make this real, she needed to act. Without giving herself time to think, she turned and strode across the room toward her parents, feeling Miles's eyes on her back. She found them chatting with a group of potential donors, talking animatedly about the foundation's work and the family's role in the community. "Mom, Dad," she said, interrupting their conversation, her voice trembling but steady. "I need to tell you something." They turned to her, surprised, and her mother gave a polite but confused smile. "What is it, dear?" "We're just discussing the foundation." Lila took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "Actually, I need you to know that I'm not just here to help the family image. I'm here because I want to make a real difference. And I've decided I'm going to do that in my own way." Her father's smile faltered, his brow furrowing. "Lila, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about not needing to live up to anyone else's expectations," she said, feeling a surge of confidence as the words spilled out. "I want to build a life that's meaningful to me, not just one that meets your standards. And that includes choosing who I want to be with, regardless of what people think." Her mother's eyes widened and she glanced around, clearly embarrassed. "Lila, this is hardly the place." "It's exactly the place," she replied, her voice firm. "Because this is who I am. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of trying to fit into a world that doesn't let me be myself." She could feel the weight of the room, the eyes of guests turning to watch. But she didn't care. For the first time, she felt free, unburdened by the need to please anyone but herself. When she turned, Miles was standing there, watching her with an expression of quiet amazement. He moved forward, meeting her halfway, his gaze locked on hers as if she were the only person in the room. "Are you sure?" he asked softly, his voice filled with both hope and hesitation. She nodded, smiling through the tears that had started to gather in her eyes. "I've never been more sure." He let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing as he took her hand, pulling her close. "Then I'm with you." They stood there, surrounded by the murmurs of the crowd, her parents' shocked expressions, and the glimmering lights of the city outside. But in that moment, all she could feel was the warmth of his hand in hers, the steady beat of his heart, and the realization that she'd finally found something real, something worth fighting for. And as they turned to face the future together, she knew that no matter what came next, they'd face it side by side. The gala had wrapped up in a whirlwind of goodbyes, handshakes, and the faint murmur of guests still buzzing about the night's unexpected moments. Lila barely noticed the guests leaving, the staff packing up, or the volunteers taking down the last of the decorations. All she felt was Miles's hand warm in hers as they stood together, the quiet of the emptying ballroom settling around them. For once, she didn't feel the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her. She didn't feel the invisible wall that had always separated her from the world she was supposed to belong to. Instead, she felt free, grounded by a sense of purpose and a certainty she'd spent her whole life searching for. Miles was watching her, his gaze filled with that same quiet amazement she'd seen when she'd stood up to her parents. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, as if grounding her in the moment. "I can't believe you did that," he said softly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She laughed, the sound light and unguarded, surprising even herself. "I can't believe it either. I never thought I'd have the nerve." "Well, you did," he replied, his eyes softening. "And, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you, Lila." The sincerity in his voice made her heart swell. She'd spent so much time looking for validation from people who only saw her as an extension of the Montgomery legacy. But with Miles, the approval wasn't conditional. It was just real. They stood there in comfortable silence, letting the weight of the night settle between them. She thought about everything that had led her to this moment. All the compromises, all the doubts and fears she'd let go of tonight. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but now she felt ready to face them. "So," she said, breaking the silence with a playful smile, "what do we do now? Start planning the next big event?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "I think we've earned a break. Let's just take it one day at a time. No gala planning, no endless meetings. Just us." "Just us," she echoed, feeling the words settle comfortably in her chest. As they stood together, she felt a warmth spread through her, the kind of warmth she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just attraction or even admiration. It was a connection that felt as solid and enduring as the ground beneath her feet. "Let's get out of here," he said suddenly, his eyes bright with an energy that made her feel like a teenager sneaking out for the first time. "We've spent enough time in this ballroom." She grinned, letting him pull her toward the exit. As they left the building, the cool night air hit her face, refreshing after the stuffy warmth of the gala. The city lights stretched out before them, the streets quieter now, and she felt a thrill of excitement as they walked hand in hand into the night. They didn't say much as they strolled through the city, taking in the sights and sounds around them. It was like discovering the city anew, this time with someone who saw it the way she did, without pretense, without expectations, just a shared sense of wonder. Finally, they found themselves by the waterfront, where the city skyline reflected off the river, shimmering in the moonlight. They stopped by the railing, looking out over the water, the quiet lapping of waves mingling with the distant hum of the city. "This feels surreal," she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Like I'm in a dream." "It's real," he replied, wrapping an arm around her. "And it's just the beginning." They stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Lila felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. A few weeks later, Lila found herself back in the community center's modest office, sunlight spilling through the windows as she sat beside Miles, looking over plans for the center's expansion. A blueprint of the project lay across the table, surrounded by coffee cups and sticky notes scrawled with ideas. Miles had roped her into co-leading this new initiative, and she'd surprised herself by agreeing. No glamour, no high society spotlight, just the kind of work she'd never known she could love. She glanced at Miles as he leaned over the blueprint, his eyes alight with a mix of focus and excitement. He was explaining something about the new classroom spaces they were planning, his hands gesturing animatedly, and she couldn't help but smile. This was a world so different from the one she'd grown up in, yet every day she felt more at home here. "So what do you think?" he asked, catching her watching him. "I think," she replied, leaning closer, "that this is the best decision I've ever made." He grinned, a warmth in his gaze that made her feel like everything was finally falling into place. "Well, I'm glad to have you on board, Ms. Montgomery." "Oh, just wait until I start proposing changes to the budget," she teased. "Then you'll regret it." "Never," he replied, his voice softening as he took her hand. "I wouldn't change a single thing about this." They sat in comfortable silence, their hands entwined, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through settle into a shared calm. Lila thought about the gala, her confrontation with her parents, the decision to break away from the world she'd once thought she had to belong to. And as she looked at Miles, she realized how much she'd changed. Not just for him, but for herself. "This isn't what I expected my life would look like," she admitted quietly. "But I don't think I'd want it any other way." Miles nodded, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's just the beginning, Lila. And this time, we get to build it together." A wave of emotion washed over her, a deep sense of peace and excitement. She could see a future now, one that felt true, one where she wasn't bound by expectations or someone else's rules. With him, she felt like she could be herself. No compromises, no apologies. "So," she said, glancing down at the blueprint with a grin, "let's get started." As they leaned over the plans together, mapping out a new future, Lila felt a quiet joy settle in her heart. She didn't know what the road ahead would hold, but with Miles by her side, she knew it would be filled with meaning, with love, and with the freedom to be exactly who she was. And that, she realized, was worth everything. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. Meet Alexander Jameson, millionaire, power player, and king of a world he's about to leave behind. After building an empire and locking himself in a fortress of wealth, he's ready to give it all away. But when an uninvited guest crashes his farewell gala, everything changes.